Muito bom dia, sexta-feira, dia 23 de maio, convido você a encontrar o seu assento, lugar onde você vai ficar agora de manhã para a palestra, painel. Se você está no fundo aí, está vendo outras pessoas aí no hall de entrada, dá uma chamadinha aí, me ajuda, nos ajuda com isso, e nós vamos dar início ao nosso tempo hoje de manhã. Gostaria de convidar você a orar junto comigo, e já convido também Guilherme e a Marino para nos ajudar com as canções da manhã, e logo depois teremos Guilherme de Carvalho, seguido de um painel aqui em inglês. Então, se você tem necessidade, a palestra e o painel serão em inglês. Se você tem necessidade, por favor, pegue lá o seu fone, deixe um documento e assim vai facilitar a compreensão. Senhor, nós te agradecemos muito por um novo dia, agradecemos pelo teu cuidado, e pedimos que o Senhor nos dê sabedoria e humildade diante de tantos temas diferentes, de tantos insights, de tantas novas ideias e atravessamentos, e que o Senhor nos ajude não apenas a compreender todos esses conceitos, mas também aplicá-los nas nossas igrejas locais, nas nossas organizações, nossos papéis em família, sociedade, enfim. Muito obrigado, Senhor, pela beleza da tua criação e a possibilidade que a gente tem, não apenas por meio da tradição neocalvinista, mas também a partir dela, de refletir sobre a complexidade da vida, a complexidade do cosmos e podermos tatear, explorar, estressar ideias e entender e compreender um pouquinho mais da tua glória, da tua beleza, que a gente vai poder desfrutar para a eternidade. Obrigado por esse tempo, em nome de Jesus. Amém.
Bom dia. Vamos cantar um pouquinho, são duas canções nesse tempo que temos para reflexão, para canto público, para que a gente possa também ajustar os nossos corações. Essa é uma canção chamada Por Todos os Dias, que está num trabalho nosso chamado Homem Litúrgico. E ela procura, a partir de uma oração dentro do livro de oração comum, a ser um clamor da igreja para que o Espírito Santo guie e direcione o nosso andar. Convido você a ficar de pé, a gente vai cantar essa canção por todos os dias. Ó Deus, cujos dias não têm fim, quão grande é a tua compaixão, faz-nos sensíveis ao comum. A vida é breve e incerta, que o teu Espírito lidere o nosso andar em justiça e santidade, mesmo no vale do sofrer, por todos os dias. Quando a nossa geração passar, servindo a quem se foi, a quem será, faz-nos sensíveis ao comum. A vida é breve e incerta. Que o teu Espírito lidere o nosso andar em justiça e santidade, mesmo no vale do sofrer, por todos os dias. Que o teu Espírito lidere o nosso andar em justiça e santidade, mesmo no vale do sofrer, por todos os dias. Em comunhão, confiança e fé, na esperança em ti, por meio de Cristo nosso Senhor, em teu perfeito amor, por todos os dias. Que o teu Espírito lidere o nosso andar em justiça e santidade, mesmo no vale do sofrer, por todos os dias. Que o teu Espírito lidere o nosso andar em justiça e santidade, mesmo no vale do sofrer, por todos os dias. Por todos os dias. Por todos os dias. Por todos os dias. Amém. Glória a Deus. Por vezes, quando nós estamos na caminhada cristã, e é por isso que é importante que não só a dimensão intelectual da vida, mas o nosso coração, sentimentos, vontades, aquilo que muitas vezes está escondido por detrás das nossas falas de citações e compreensões filosóficas ou então científicas de qualquer coisa. Por vezes nós podemos perder a piedade e viver numa piedade mascarada e longe daquilo que o Senhor intenta, longe daquilo que é de fato um coração quebrantado diante do Senhor. E por vezes no meio do estudo acadêmico, no meio da vida ministerial, no meio da nossa jornada pública, a confiança em Deus pode se imiscuir, perder, se diluir. E às vezes nós podemos estar nesse sentido com falta de confiança em Deus. Eu estou falando porque eu já passei por isso. Eu estou falando porque isso acontece. E por vezes a nossa confiança no Pai pode ser só algo etéreo. Essa é uma oração que surgiu nesse momento de vida. Quando a confiança falta, quando a fé parece se diluir, quando há uma impossibilidade aparente de enxergar quem Deus é. A conversão, a redenção proposta ao coração, ela transforma você e eu para que a gente possa viver uma piedade não fingida. É um termo que aparece lá em João Calvino, nas Institutas. Para que a gente possa, de fato, transparecer com os nossos atos, palavras e, ao mesmo tempo, com os nossos relacionamentos, aquilo que o Senhor faz no nosso coração. Então essa é uma canção que surgiu nesse momento de angústia. Uma música chamada Confiança, talvez você conheça, uma das nossas canções do Projeto Sola. E é justamente essa fala: Deus, ó Pai, ajuda a confiar, mesmo quando a confiança me faltar. Me ajuda a enxergar, mesmo quando o meu olhar falhar. Então, no meio dos nossos passos vacilantes, dos nossos joelhos muitas vezes que não conseguem se dobrar, Deus quebranta o nosso coração, Deus nos lança ao chão para que a gente se lembre de fato do lugar onde caímos e para que a gente possa ter essa memória constante da obra redentora do Criador em nossos corações. Para que o Espírito nos movimente também a pensar, a sempre avançar e usar a nossa criatividade, mas também para que o Espírito nos quebrante, nos coloque diante da cruz, e que nós possamos voltar os nossos olhos a Jesus, e depois voltar os nossos olhos a Jesus, e depois voltar os nossos olhos a Jesus, e assim viver uma vida de uma piedade não fingida, de uma fé genuína, que nos descentraliza de nós mesmos, e nos lança na direção do Senhor, e na direção de uns aos outros. Então, confiança. Se você quiser, você pode orar essa canção também. Pai, Deus poderoso, tem compaixão de mim. Preciso da tua graça abundante aqui. Quebra o meu coração e salva-me de mim. Faz-me bem-aventurado em ti. Pai, Deus de justiça, misericórdia, amor, confesso que me afastei, me esqueci de ti. Eu não sou mais que os outros, me ensine a ver quem sou. Faz-me doar ao invés de possuir. Esvazia o meu ego, enche-me de ti. Ajuda-me a confiar, mesmo quando a confiança me falta. Ajuda-me a enxergar, mesmo quando meu olhar falhar. Pai, Deus poderoso, tem compaixão de mim. Preciso da tua graça abundante aqui. Quebra o meu coração e salva-me de mim. Faz-me bem-aventurado em ti. Pai, Deus de justiça, misericórdia, amor, confesso que me afastei, me esqueci de ti. Eu não sou mais que os outros, me ensine a ver quem sou. Faz-me doar ao invés de possuir. Esvazia o meu ego, enche-me de ti. Ajuda-me a confiar, mesmo quando a confiança me falta. Ajuda-me a enxergar, mesmo quando meu olhar falhar. Ajuda-me a confiar, mesmo quando a confiança me falta. Ajuda-me a enxergar, mesmo quando meu olhar falhar. Amém. Pode sentar, gente. Agora eu queria chamar aqui, por ironia do destino, também tem o mesmo nome que nós, Guilherme de Carvalho, para a sua palestra. Ó, palmas para ele.
Good morning. Pessoal, eu vou fazer a palestra em inglês, foi solicitado especialmente. Então, assim, os gringos não facilitaram para nós, hein? Mas nós estamos muito felizes e quero dizer aí um bom dia, em português também. Bom dia, Neo-Calvinistas. First of all, I want to thank to the Lord for this wonderful conference and the people which He gathered here. And I'm especially thankful also to the guys behind this event, Professors Matthew Kimming, James Eglinton, George Harrick, and of course our common friend, Ednardo. As you know, I'm a pastor, not an academic, and I'm sort of a wandering chaplain, kicking off and nudging movements like the Brazilian Neo-Calvinist movement, Christians in science, things in faith and politics, law and human rights, liturgical renewal, and things like that. Therefore, what I'm offering this moment is more like a sort of pastoral advice to Christians, Christian scholars, Christians in university. But this pastoral advice is inspired by the Neo-Calvinist conception of the munus triplex, or munus triplex, or the three offices, prophet, priest, and king. Ed, como é que eu controlo a apresentação? É com isso aqui? O Ed está por aí? Ok. Obrigado. Munus triplex is found among the lot of dogmatics within the doctrine of Christ and his mediatory activity. Less common is its consideration under the theme of theology of culture and more broadly Christian mission. However, I'm very convinced that this is most needed today, an important unfolding of the biblical truth, and a very promising one to give guidance to Christian scholarship, also especially in Brazil, I think. Yet, given our short time, I will skip any biblical and dogmatical exploration around it and go straight on to the Neo-Calvinist developments of the concept and Now, how can we use that for culture and mission work? But of course, I must start with this theological core. Oh, let's see if I do it properly. Great. So many of you know that quotation from lectures on Calvinism, and this is a very important concept for us. King indeed, prophet in profession, and priest in heart, shall men in this threefold office stand before God. So this is the core idea behind our lecture and also our advice to Christian scholars and people in university. Following Kuyper on it, Bavinck seeks a non-arbitrary explanation for these three offices and finds it projecting it anthropologically as universal human need, rooted in the very nature of our created humanity. So this is important for the whole project here. Of course, it's Christology, but then Kuyper and Doivert would speak about it anthropologically. The truth is that the idea of humanness already encompasses within itself this threefold dignity and activity. Human beings have a head to know, a heart to give themselves, a hand to govern and to lead. Correspondingly, they were in the beginning equipped by God with knowledge and understanding, with righteousness and holiness, with dominion and glory. The sin that corrupted human beings infected all their capacities. The importance of this point is that the office's Christology retrospectively implies an anthropology of offices and prospectively grounds an ecclesiology of offices. Following Kuyper and Bavinck, we could speak about these three kinds of power in church as the power to teach the truth, the power to lead to goodness, and the power to consecrate, reconcile, and restore beauty. This is a way to understand in a holistic way and Christological way the Christian mission. And that can help us to guide Christian presence, as Matthew Kimmig and Corey Wilson pointed out in their book, well-recommended book, Work and Worship. Those who follow Christ are called to follow this threefold calling. What does this mean for workers? Called to be prophets, workers have a responsibility to speak up and advocate for God's truth and justice in their daily work. Called to be priests, workers have a responsibility to engage in the ministry of reconciliation and intercession in their workplace. Called to be kings and queens, workers have a royal responsibility to steward their power well and execute justice in the workplace. As workers grow in Christ, they increasingly live out this threefold calling to be prophets, priests, and kings in the workplace. So what we are doing is just trying to expand and apply that core insight to the Christian scholarship effort. This Christological interpretation of human and ecclesiastical tasks clarifies the universal need for mediation with deity, reflected in the search for wisdom and knowledge in different traditions and intellectual projects, in the priestly quest for union and integration in various religions and also in popular culture, and in efforts for technical and political mastery of nature and human societies. In this sense, the Munus Triplex provides categories for Christian cultural analysis and public theology. In parodying Kuyper's phrase, we get a summary of this Christian academic mission in a nutshell. Kings in the service to the academy, prophets in scientific and Christian explanation, and priests in secular and sacred reconciliation. And then I must tell that all this idea was initially developed within the ABC2, or Christians in Science, or Cristãos na Ciência initiative, to give some guidance to our people there. But of course, it's inspired in Neo-Calvinism. So let's go to each point. Kings in academic deeds. So Kuyper says like that, king in deed. Grounding the biblical paradigm of the Davidic kingdom and covenant in 2 Samuel 7, the messianic prophecies about the Messiah like Isaiah 42, and the New Testament teaching about Christ as the servant king, which disarmed the heavenly and earthly powers through his cross, I would express the royal task of God's people in the academic world as Catholicity, Shalom, and Service. It's a kind of summing up. Catholicity in the Bavinkian sense of the kingdom's cosmic extension and universality, Shalom as a situation of peace, justice, and common good, service as loving exercise of power. But what would that mean for scientific communities? Catholicity is the easiest one. To explain, not to practice. I'll just mention that it means an intellectual attitude open to all aspects of life, different cultures, and everything human, yet seeing everything under the cross. It would be reflected in transdisciplinary work and a Christ-centered encyclopedia of the sciences, which is an old-fashioned concept, but I feel still very representative. And then I'll quote again Bavinck. Here the gospel comes fully into its own, comes to true Catholicity. There's nothing that cannot or ought not to be evangelized. Not only the church, but also home, school, society, and state are placed under the dominion of the principle of Christianity. And then I need to say that whatever dominionism concept or concern we have, the language of dominion is native, in a way, from Neo-Calvinism. And the interpretation we give to that is the thing. But let's go ahead. Then what about Shalom? Let's remember the example of the Old Covenant. Both land and people mattered under God. The land itself belonged to the Lord and should be respected by one hand, and the well-being of the people who lived in that land should be protected by the other hand. And taking it as starting point, we could speak of internal goods of the academic community, such as knowledge and its correct means of production. It should be protected, but also the means of fair distribution to people and their inclusion in the knowledge system should be promoted. This reflection would directly apply to a range of urgent problems. Yet I'll just pick up two. The first is the recurring phenomenon of the political ideological dominance over scientific activity, which by supplanting the search for truth in the name of an agenda, destroys the internal freedom of science. Some of the best warnings ever written in this regard were produced by the scientist and philosopher Michael Polanyi, and were collected in his work, The Logic of Liberty, Reflections and Rejoinders, from 1951, where he defended the self-government of the scientific sphere around the telos of the search for truth and the cultivation of the internal goods and intellectual virtues of the scientific sphere. More recently, Jonathan Haidt and the organization Heterodox Academy have worked out an international academic movement to bring very important practical discernments regarding that. The telos of the university can be truth or social justice, but not both at the same time and in the same way. Or rather, any justice that demands to subject scientific truth to social transformation agenda is in fact injustice and destroys the internal goods of the academic activity. In Polanyi's aforementioned work, we find this insightful treatment of the famous Lysenko case, which has much to teach us about a similar problem today, the impact of political identitarianism in the contemporary academic world. The destructive effects of this loss of the university's mission were recently documented in Yasha Maunk's masterful work, The Identity Trap, published in 2023, which deserves, in my opinion, maximum attention at this time when wokeism is just losing its grip in the West and a breach has been opened in the walls for honest conversations about that. The second problem, which I would just mention here, is the monopoly of academic power and the whole knowledge economy in the sense employed by Musa al-Gharbi, by a very secular cultural elite in a country, in the case of Brazil, where the masses are largely adhering to conservative Catholicism and to popular evangelicalism. That monopoly steers the Brazilian version of Michael Lind's new class war and tends to engulf Christian scholarship efforts in this new class struggle, converting many new evangelical scholars into reproducers of the elite ideology and turning them against their religious communities, but also making the unconverted scholars, unconverted to ideology, making them growingly radicalized, also politically. As you have probably noted at this point, what I'm proposing is that sphere sovereignty is not an outdated concept, as some friends have argued, but a very urgent principle whose defense is a direct expression of the Church's kingship office. Yet, as we face those challenges, we must remember that Christ's messianic kingship was established and manifested itself through loving service. And this is my third point. Christians are not barred from occupying positions of power within the scientific community, but this needs to be done through acts of positive service, not dominion. Here, the notion of faithful presence proposed by James Davison Hunter in his book, To Change the World, from 2010, applies very well. A theology of faithful presence obligates us to do what we are able under the sovereignty of God to shape the patterns of life and work and relationship, that is, the institutions of which our lives are constituted, toward a shalom that seeks the welfare not only of those of the house of God, but of all. We are not allowed to forget Christ's lordship when we do anything, including academics. But then we must follow Jesus serving people where we are. Interestingly, Dr. Hunter relates the shaping of life and institutions under the sovereignty of God to the task of promoting shalom and universal service. I would really recommend Hunter's entire conception of faithful presence as a very fresh translation of the kingship office in terms of contemporary Christian public presence. Our second point, prophets in academic profession. What about prophecy? The first time I ever thought about academic life from the standpoint of prophetism was in Dr. Herbert Skierman living room in Brooklyn, precisely on 20th August 2016. We met at Saturday for lunch and then spent the afternoon in a very lively conversation about the affective revolution, you know that, and some of those themes. And then, remembering reformational big shots like Doivert, Brookmacher, and Hausfeld, he used that phrase completely outside my expectations. In their time, these men were prophetic intellectuals. He said like that. And I was surprised by it, and I replied, what do you mean by prophetic? Because I didn't think like that. I don't remember the exact words, but the force of what he said was very impressive for me. It was like that. Yes, prophetic. Their scholarship was not scholastic. They expounded sharply and relevantly on the spiritual reality of the world, of culture, illuminating its condition. And I miss that today, he said it. We urgently need that prophetic intellectuals who interpret and challenge the heart of contemporary society. So he was like craving for that. I had never thought of Herman Doivert as prophetic. And you know, I'm a charismatic. But prophetic means for Sherman, like not merely moral denunciation, which is a very common evangelical imagination. I mean, it's very common among us, both for the conservative and also for the progressive who read Brueggemann. But, you know, this is actually a poor understanding of prophetism, in any case. Prophetism for Skierman meant light, but not just in a theoretical sense of explanatory capacity, but a very special kind of light that reveals the spiritual state of culture and offers hope. Such kind of insight, which hits at a level somewhat different from mere technical competence, really depends on charisma, ou carisma, dons espirituais, I went to Portuguese. A particular divine grace, which could resemble at times a genius looking from outside. The prophetic scholarship not only penetrates from an analytical or critical point of view, but performs a work of distinctly spiritual nature, exposing on one hand the depths of the heart, and on the other hand, announcing the necessity, the possibility, and even the proximity of the divine in some cases. Like in 1 Corinthians 14, it's like that, the prophecy gifted there. And then he even quoted Francis Schaeffer as an example of prophetic intellectual connecting Doiverd and Francis Schaeffer. I want to highlight the core trait of prophetism. It's charisma, but the matter is giving witness to Jesus Christ as the Alpha and Omega of all reality. This would be the prophetism thing. This is the very spirit of it. It's Revelation 19, you can read that. It does not mean that it must speak of Jesus explicitly, yet it must show, as to say, resonance with the gospel and with a Christ-centered image of the world. It takes us then to charismatic and apologetic side of the Christian intellectual work. I understand that many Christian scholars avoid any effort to highlight the evidence, the truth, and the exceptionality of our faith. I agree, it should not be done in a shallow way or a triumphalistic way, yet assurance and good reasons usually compel intellectuals to speak out and argue. And the truth is that many Christian scholars avoid speaking out their faith because they are not very sure about its importance to life, society, and science. They simply lack boldness. I would quote here the inspiring words of Dr. Doiverd in his introduction to the first edition before the new critique, the Weisbegehrte der Wetsidee from 1935. So I read that. The precarious and changing appreciation of our fellow men counts for little when weighed against the inner joy and happiness that the exercise of scholarship confers upon those who take their point of departure in Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the life. Here we get a taste of what makes academic prophethood, not denunciation, moral denunciation, but explicit and unapologetic Christocentrism, the assurance that he is the way, the truth, and the life of the Christian intellectual endeavor, and regarding our faith commitment, boldness, and freedom from human judgment. What can give such a boldness to a Christian scholar? The book of Acts associates boldness to speak truth in love to the Pentecostal blessing of the Holy Spirit. Boldness not just to pursue general truth, but to risk your academic neck for Christ-centered intellectual work. This is sure sign of academic prophethood. The promise and the calling to divine courage is open to every Christian, including the ones which are academic. And then our third point, priests in academic heart. Bavinck relates priesthood in church with mercy ministries, yet also with devotion. Yet I see Kuyper clear on this matter. For him, priesthood has to do with God experience and mysticism. Let's turn to the famous quotation in his lectures on Calvinism. Oh, I'm sorry. This is a nice pic. No doubt, mysticism irradiates a fervor that warms the heart, and woe betide the giant of dogma and the hero of action who are strangers to its depths and tenderness. God created hand, head, and heart. The hand for the deed, the head for the world, and the heart for mysticism. King indeed, and then you have the shorter quotation. King indeed, prophet in profession, and priest in heart, shall man in this threefold office stand before God. And a Christianity that neglects the mystic element grows frigid and congeals. We are therefore to be accounted fortunate whenever a mystic atmosphere envelops us, making us breathe the balmy air of spring. Thou its life is made truer, deeper, and richer. Kuyper is actually criticizing, in the paragraph, the overemphasis on the mystical dimension, arguing that mysticism is pointless, without truth and conviction, yet in doing that, he nails it. We could then speak about church's three kinds of power as the power to teach the truth, the power to lead to goodness, and the power to consecrate, reconcile, and restore beauty. Priesthood would mean acts of consecration, following from a devoted heart. It has everything to do with worship and communion, and with enveloping our places with a mystic atmosphere, and I will insist on it. Contemporary biblical theology has uncovered the grand view of God's creation as a cosmic temple, having the human being as both the divine representative and the cosmic priest, called to consecrate the world to God's glory. This understanding has helped to highlight the theocentric telos of Christian mission. Yet the core idea is not new at all. Listen to the words of Robert Boyle, the patron of modern chemistry and the greatest of the so-called physical theologians, what he wrote in the middle of the 17th century. I esteem the world a temple. I may elsewhere have occasion to declare, but this for the present. It would not be rash to infer that if the world is a temple, man sure must be the priest ordained to celebrate the divine service, not only in it, but for it. This is just great. The human priesthood of nature, recovered through Christ, meant something spiritual for the scientific life of early modern scientists. This is a theme in Christians in Science, you know that. We always speak about it. This is also beautifully illustrated in the life and work of the astronomer Johann Kepler, a devout Lutheran who considered for a while to become a religious minister, but had his mind changed through his mathematical and astronomical explorations, and concluded that his work in astronomy was the exercise of a priestly vocation. He would insert his prayers and theological musings within the flux of his scientific rite. I find this really amazing. What we find in Kepler is a kind of science being done with prayers, and to employ Kuyper's language, within a mystical atmosphere. Kepler's scientific priesthood was a theocentric state of research consciousness. The Scottish theologian Thomas Torrance recovers this old view of man as the priest of creation to explain the complementary relationship between natural science and theological science, arguing for this topicality. Man as a scientist can be spoken as the priest of creation, whose office is to interpret the books of nature written by the finger of God, to unravel the universe in its marvelous patterns and symmetries, and to bring it all into orderly articulation in such a way that it fulfills its proper end as the vast theater of glory in which the Creator is worshipped, hymned, and praised by his creatures. Without man, nature is dumb, but it is man's part to give it word, to be its mouth, through which the whole universe gives voice to the glory and majesty of the living God. I find Dr. Torrance's words very pragmatic for our common priestly task. We must voice creation's praise in an intelligible way. And it brings us back to Kepler. The fifth book of his work, Harmonices Mundi, or The Harmony of the World, includes an envoi composed to end his argument, closing with a long and beautiful prayer. We see him there worshiping God for his works, giving thanks to the divine illumination, for the divine illumination and for his scientific accomplishments, consecrating his work to the Lord, seeking forgiveness for his mistakes, and praying that his work does not obstruct the way of the gospel. Incredible. To be in the presence of such an academic priest should be like approaching a religious service. Priesthood, according to Kuyper and Bavinck, conscripts your heart and your most deep affections. However, there is a common temptation for the Christian scholar to circumscribe their missional duties to mere virtuous and technical correct thinking, discounting the effective source of religious life and its indispensable mystical ambience. Such spiritual contraction often reflects in poor church attendance, despise of collective worship, especially against its more extravagant and emotional expressions like the Pentecostal and charismatic ones, evangelistic science, and weak devotional life. Yet the normal Christian experience is the feeling of dependence of God and the clear awareness of his grace and presence, the testimonium spiritus sancti internum. These feelings, experiences are the sources of every form of Christian priesthood, including the academic one. And then we can think of the multiple ethical overtones related to this core experience, like sacramental awareness, a thirsty for God's presence, gratitude before the wonders of creation, the prayer practices which the Christian academic must add to his ordinary work before and after reading, while reading or working in the lab, the prayer for other partners in research, and with them, when possible. And finally, I must quote another important biblical passage which summarizes the double duties of our priesthood. In Hebrews 13, you have that. It's both to offer a public sacrifice of praise, even under the risk of rejection, and to help partners sharing knowledge, technical resources, network, and finances, so that science and knowledge progress for the glory of God. And here we point out a possible explanation for the well-known objection against Neo-Calvinism regarding the quality of the movement's piety. Some relate Neo-Calvinism's spiritual weakness to the loss of beatific vision, which surfaces, for example, in the widespread tendency of Kuyperians to dismiss Piperians. Although some good work has been done to explain that Kuyper and Bavinck are not to be blamed for it, it makes me remember how difficult it is to separate Aquinas from the Thomist dualism. In Labrie, we have an interesting story, and I'm about to close. We have an interesting story on that matter, mentioned by Rookmaker in a tape-recorded lecture and repeated. That's it. And repeated in an interview to Colin Durius for the Crusade magazine in 1972. It was in 1948 that I met Schaeffer, and I was a bit dissatisfied with Dutch Christianity, which I felt was in some cases below what it should be, particularly on the level of personal faith and way of walking with the Lord. On the other hand, I felt that Anglo-Saxon Christianity really lacks the intellectual insight we have developed in Holland. I hope not anymore. In a way, what Schaeffer and I have tried to do, he's speaking about Labrie, is to fuse the two things to make them into something new. My question is, was Rookmaker so far away historically from the first generation of Neo-Calvinists to be so mistaken on it? My own guess is that the loss of beatific vision, although not missed by Bavinck, is a widespread disease in modern theology, contaminating the liberation theologies, the transformationist missiologies like the Latin American Missão Integral movement, and even Neo-Calvinism. I have called it the great teleological drift, which deepens as church craves for historical relevance, forgetting worship. Yet the story opens an interesting window. Labrie was really thought in the beginning to bridge prayer, hospitality, and Reformed Catholicity. I would describe L'Abri as a true recovering of the priestly office within the Neo-Calvinistic movement and a good standard for intellectual priesthood. Concluding, I believe that the Neo-Calvinist understanding of the Munus triplex offers solid basis and guidance for a Brazilian Christian scholarship movement, and I have pinpointed some very simple and specific postures we must take in this historical moment. Protect the internal goods of the academic sphere, find boldness in God to work out Christ-centered thinking and academic enterprises, and reunite Reformed Catholicity to prayer and the practice of God's presence. Thank you.
Have a seat right there. I'm going to talk to you, sir. Mr. Carvalho, thank you so much for a wonderful lecture. My name, once again, is Matthew Kamink. I'm a professor of Christian ethics and public theology at Fuller Seminary. Thank you so much for a wonderful and thoughtful lecture. One of the areas that I work in is faith, work, the marketplace, and economics. And I encounter quite often in my work a group of economic prophets, economic kings and queens, and economic priests. The prophets talk a lot about economic justice and telling the truth and speaking out against economic ills and sins. The economic priests are often workers who are trying to do priestly work to worship God and to commune with God while they work in the marketplace. They talk about prayers and spiritual disciplines. I also work with chaplains who work in different corporations and industries, who help workers connect with God and pray with God and walk with God as they work, to do that integration work. And then I also work with economic kings and queens, people who are managers and entrepreneurs and business owners. And they have a great deal of economic power and agency. And their questions are much more around, how do I steward this power, this garden that I've been given? How do I steward it with wisdom and with care and with justice? And all too often, these three groups of people do not talk to one another. They either ignore one another or they criticize one another. And what I found in your talk and in the work of Herman Bavinck and others is an understanding of a rich and complex Christology, a rich and complex way to follow Christ in the marketplace that argues that, yes, we must tell the truth about issues of economic justice. We must study economics in the marketplace. But we are also called to steward and to use and to execute our economic power with wisdom and justice. And then also what you have offered is a priestly understanding of work, that it is an offering of praise. Our work is a time to worship God, that we do not simply have worship on Sunday and the rest of the week we work, but Sunday morning is the beginning of a whole life of work. And so I want to thank you for what you've offered to us today. And specifically, I'd like to take just this moment before we break for coffee to thank you for all of your work with L'Abri. And here in Brazil, spending these last few days here in Brazil, it is clear the love and appreciation that our brothers and sisters throughout Brazil have for your leadership, your wisdom, your generosity, and your kindness. So I thank you, sir. I thank you. Would you please give a... You don't get to respond. We want to, I'm very grateful. We want to give you lots of time for coffee and fellowship. This is our last time here together. This is our final day. I do want to give a little bit of a sneak peek, actually, and say that we've been having some very encouraging conversations with Mackenzie University. And we have heard that there is some real interest in having another gathering like this in the future. We don't have any details on this yet, but we are very hopeful, and we have received some wonderful encouragement from the people at Mackenzie here that this is something that they would like to host again. So that is also quite wonderful news. So friends, will you please join us all over for some time of coffee? You can get some books. We have a new shipment of books in Portuguese on Reformed Public Theology out there. And yes, thank you again, Mr.